from Washington, this is an ABC News special.
Good evening. Once again, we thank Nightline for giving us this time to deal with an issue of enormous importance to the world as a whole. Tonight, live in Washington and in Moscow, we can hopefully foster a meaningful and even lively debate on the state of the world's environment. This is the 5th edition of Capital to Capital. During previous encounters on Capital to Capital, members of the U.S. Congress and members of the Supreme Soviet have discussed and debated, live and unedited, mutual security.
I would like to say to you that the so-called imbalance in conventional armaments in favor of the Warsaw Treaty is a legend.
Human rights.
And what the world thinks, and what is true, is that the Soviet Union has been a hell for human rights.
And the quality of their respective leaders. Tonight, the quality of life. We will also involve more of the world because our subject tonight is global. We will join Moscow and Washington with Western Europe and South America. And this is the telling background to our conversation. In the next 90 minutes, while we are talking about the environment, almost 250 million trees will be cut down. The United States will pump almost 3 million pounds of raw sewage into the ocean. The Soviets will dump almost 300,000 gallons of chemical waste into the Caspian Sea alone. Throughout the world, in the next 90 minutes, our cars and trucks and motorcycles will burn 10 million gallons of fuel and pump another 120,000 tons of carbon monoxide into the global atmosphere. We are destroying the global home in which we live.
From ABC News, this is Capital to Capital. Tonight, live from the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet in Moscow, and from the Rayburn Office Building on Capitol Hill in Washington. This evening, the environment, crisis in the global village. Here now, Peter Jennings.
Good evening. Now let me introduce our players. Joining me here live on Capitol Hill representing the U.S. Congress, Senator Max Baucus, the Democrat from the state of Montana. He is chairman of the Senate's Subcommittee on Environmental Protection. And from the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Claudine Schneider, a Republican from Rhode Island. She is the author of the Global Warming Prevention Act, which is pending before the Congress and will surely come up here this evening. In Moscow, representing the almost brand new Congress of People's Deputies, 2 newly elected members, Alexei Yablokov, who's a biologist, and Yuri Sherbak, who's from the Ukraine, an epidemiologist and a journalist. And the Soviet moderator, for in the spirit of ecumenism, we always have 2 moderators, Leonid Zolotarevsky from Soviet television. And to broaden our discussion, because no one is immune from pollution, 2 other nations are represented tonight. In London, David Trippier, Conservative member of the British Parliament and Minister of State for the Environment. And from the capital of Brazil, home of the great Amazon rainforest, which is under siege, Fabio Feldman, the first avowed environmentalist elected to the Brazilian Congress. It is our world we want to talk about this evening. When the Exxon Valdez went aground in Alaska last March, 11 million gallons of oil were sent towards the Pacific Ocean. $1.25 billion has been spent to clean it up so far. Damage to the world food chain and wildlife won't be understood for years. When a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in the Soviet Union exploded, radiation was spread as far across Western Europe as the British Isles. Reindeer in Finland and sheep in Wales are still too radioactive to send to market. Last month, 100,000 more residents in contaminated areas around the reactor had to be evacuated. That's more than 3 years after the accident. 600,000 citizens are still tested twice a year for signs of illness. When the utility companies in America's Ohio Valley produce electricity with coal-fired generators, the sulfur dioxide in the smoke combines with moist air to form sulfuric acid. It falls on the northeastern United States and Canada as acid rain. And when the power generators in East Germany, the worst polluter per capita in Europe, burn high sulfur coal, the resultant acid rain kills forests in Eastern and Western Europe. Deforestation is truly a global problem. Trees absorb the carbon dioxide from auto emissions and smokestacks and give us back oxygen. We chop down 4 billion trees in the world every day. We are literally in the process of choking ourselves to death. About 80% of the world's pollution is caused by the world's industrial nations. The United States and the Soviet Union together contribute more than half. Environmental problems in the U.S. get a great deal of coverage from our media, and the Soviet media as well. Images of Love Canal, the radiation leak at 3 Mile Island, what could have been the American Chernobyl, the deadly dioxin spill at Times Beach in Missouri. With Glasnost, we are all finally discovering that the Soviet Union has serious problems. Every major lake and river is profoundly polluted. Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake and something of a Soviet national treasure. Over 2,000 animal and plant species are found only here. But paper mills along its shore have dumped toxic waste and killed much of the plant life that kept it clear down as far as 130 feet. And smoke from the mills is eating away at 86,000 acres of fir trees along its shores. The Aral Sea, formerly the 4th largest lake in the world, reduced by 60% for irrigation. Former fishing villages are now 30 miles inland. The Karakalpak Republic, on the sea's edge, has a high infant mortality rate because of salt and fertilizer pollution in the irrigated water. Recently, many of our leaders have found the political green of ecology to be a fashionable color. At the economic summit in Paris, President Bush called the environment a priority.
We agreed that decisive action is urgently needed to preserve the earth.
President Gorbachev, last December at the United Nations.
By our joint efforts to put an end to aggressions against nature.
The questions for tonight are these. Do our leaders' speeches and some citizens' protest mean that we are all finally willing to make the sacrifices necessary for environmental change? And how can the industrialized countries, particularly the US and the Soviet Union, preach to the developing nations not to pollute as they build their economies?
We have to get our own house in order if we are going to attempt to persuade others to address the larger global environmental issues.
It's climate change and deforestation and soil erosion. These are the real threats to the human future.
Well, there's a great deal to talk about, as you can imagine. Lester Brown is one of our guests here on Capitol Hill this evening, and he'll have something to say later. I think perhaps the best way to start, we could start a dozen different ways, is to perhaps try to give you a feel for the instincts of the people who are participating. And so we'll do something of a round table at the beginning by going first directly to Moscow, to you, if I may, Dr. Yablokov, and ask you, I hope, a fairly simple question. In America, we hear that you and the Soviet Union are beset by all sorts of problems. What do the Soviet people really want? Clean air and clean water, or do they want consumer goods?
Oh, that's a good question. We had a public opinion survey recently which showed that when people were asked what was most missing, people answered that they needed food. But when they were asked what needed to be done right away, they said ecology. There have been quite a few strikes recently, and they were not just economic but also ecological reasons behind them in the coal basins and various other parts of the country. My country is facing three main problems. the need to alter the economic situation, the ecological situation, and the nationalities question. But all these three are interrelated. They can't be taken separately. So I think we'll be coming back to them as we go through our conversation.
Well, indeed you did, and it's interesting to hear ecology so high on that list. Dr. Scherbak, you as a journalist and as an epidemiologist were one of the first Soviets to go to Chernobyl after that tragic accident there, and you've written a novel about it. What has been the enduring, ongoing impact of Chernobyl on Soviet attitudes towards the environment?
I think Chernobyl has played a tremendous part in the development of glassness in our country. Chernobyl was that point from which began a new development of public opinion. I think that Chernobyl was not only our accident, a national tragedy, it was a global tragedy for all mankind. And Chernobyl sounded a note of warning for all mankind. This is a tremendous, unprecedented event and a tremendous ecological catastrophe for the world.
Let me go briefly, if I may, to London to David Trippier, the Under-Secretary. We saw a little bit, Mr. Trippier, the effect of the Green movement on British politics and all politics. How powerful is it in Western Europe at the moment, and has much of it been affected by Soviet environmental behavior?
The answer to the latter part of the question is not at all. But you're right in suggesting that there has been an increase in awareness on environmental issues, particularly within this country, and I would suggest within the rest of Europe. We too have had an opinion survey, which we commissioned, completely independent survey, which shows that there is concern in our country on environmental issues, second only to the health service. Certainly in recent polls, and I'm particularly talking about voting, which is more important than opinion polls, it's been clear that there have been votes actually moving towards the Green Party, although it has to be said that they are not properly structured or organized. And perhaps that is the major reason as to why I've been only recently given this job as the minister responsible for environmental issues in the United Kingdom, and solely for that and nothing else.
On this first go-around, let me also go to Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, to Mr. Fabio Feldman, member of the Brazilian Congress. Mr. Feldman, your country takes it on the nose all the time these days for what is happening in the Amazon rainforest. Are we picking on you unfairly?
Yes, I think what's going on in Brazil is a real terrible problem, because we have a terrible rate of deforestation of one of the most important rainforests, and I think it's fair that the world is really concerned with what we are just doing in Brazil.
So in a sense you say we are fair in picking on you, not unfair.
You are fair, in my opinion.
Okay. I should point out that Mr. Feldman, as I think I said earlier, is the first avowed environmentalist to be elected to the Brazilian Congress. He doesn't speak for all Brazilians. We'll come back and talk about that and to our members here of Congress in just a moment.
This is Capital to Capital, live from Washington, Moscow, Brasilia, and London. Brought to you by The Travelers. You're better off under the umbrella.
Live from Moscow and from Washington, welcome back to Capital to Capital. I'm Peter Jennings on Capitol Hill. Joining me here, Senator Max Baucus of Montana. What kind of a world do we want environmentally, and what's the best we can hope for while you're in the Senate?
Well, I think basically, at least in our country, the people want security. I think that means military security. It means economic security. I think it also means environmental security.
Give us a sense of priorities.
It's changing, and I think the people are always ahead of the politicians, always ahead of those of us in government. National opinion polls in our country are the same as those reflected in the countries we've just discussed. That is, Americans are more concerned now about ecological, environmental matters. They're much less concerned about, they're much less worried about communist invasion or nuclear holocaust. They're more concerned about the environment.
And yet, Congresswoman Schneider, in 1989, fiscal 1989, as we say in America, the Environmental Protection Agency got $5.1 billion and the Defense Department got $290 billion. What's that tell us about priorities?
it clearly tells us that we need to start shifting our priorities to get a greater balance. The same is true in our budget for research in the area of defense versus commercial research. If we were to move more rapidly toward investing more money in research, for example, on energy efficiency technologies, or to speed up the development of photovoltaics, then not only would we reduce some of the energy consumption and the pollutants that we're putting in the air in this country, but would be in a better position to help, for example, Brazil to utilize the photovoltaics or the solar power.
I think it's only fair we should tell our Soviet audience that by American political standards, you are both environmental activists. How much of the Congress, of the American Congress, thinks like you two do, Senator?
Well, I think that more and more are. The best example is the recent oil spill legislation on the floor of the Senate. The Environment and Public Works Committee, of which I'm a member, reported out a very tough bill, higher liabilities on oil companies that spill, for example. When we got to the floor of the Senate, the floor said, hey, you guys are too conservative, you're not tough enough. And so amendments were passed to toughen it up even more. And maybe that's just because Exxon was the perpetrator and people want to jump on Exxon. But essentially, I think that it's changing. I think Claudine's right. We're a little behind the curve, but that the direction is more toward environmental priorities.
You do give me a clue to go to my colleague Leonid Zolotarevsky, because Leonid, at the time of the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, you know that you and the Soviet Union sent us an oil skimming ship for which Americans were very grateful. Go ahead.
Да, разумеется, мы об этом знаем, Питер. Я как раз уже на протяжении последних нескольких минут хотел сказать, что нам чрезвычайно интересно следить за тем, что происходит в Вашингтоне.
To hear what's happening in Washington. We'd also like to take part in your discussion.
И прежде чем я предоставлю
And before giving the floor
депутату Яблокову
to Deputy Yablokov and
я хотел
Sherbakov,
бы вернуть ваш вопрос
I'd like to return your question to Senator Baucus and Claudine Schneider, member of Congress. Do they think that the problem of ecology in the United States is also closely connected with political and economic problems?
There's no question in my mind that they are clearly connected. And I think that one of the advantages that we have, that we are just learning more about now, is the possibility of us having economic advantages and economic development at the same time doing the right thing for the environment. We have found, for example, the company 3M, which is a very large corporation in our country, has been able over the last 15 years to save $420 million to add to their profit margin. And at the same time, they have reduced the amount of sewage sludge, they have reduced the amount of water, they have reduced the amount of air pollutants that they have put into the air over the last 15 years substantially. And more companies, whether it be DuPont, Dow, Monsanto, and a number of others, are making great strides. And they're finding that contrary to what we're doing in Congress, and Congressman Senator Baucus said originally, yes, we are responding to crises, to the Alaska situation. But in fact now, these companies recognize that this is preventive. And preventive measures, I think, is where the economic payoffs come.
If I might make a point right there, there is a classic trade-off between environment and economy. At first blush, initially that's what everyone fears and sees.
What do you mean by trade-off, Senator?
Well, many people think you can't have it both ways. Either there's economic development or environmental protection, but not both. The fact is the opposite is very often the truth. For example, in 1970, when the Congress passed the Clean Air Act, there was no technology then available in the auto industry to lower the emissions of exhaust from automobiles. The auto industry said they couldn't do it. Congress mandated those lower emissions. The industry did it. And guess what happened? At the same time that the auto industry lowered the emissions, they developed the technology, they found a way to do it. At the same time, they also increased their productivity. They increased their efficiency of production. They also raised the gas mileage. The point being that when you change often a process to meet a new higher environmental standard, a company is then forced to re-engineer and redevelop the process, and in so doing it increases its productivity, and that is particularly important on a competitive basis, so that product is then sold. So the fact is that there's often not a trade-off, but they work in tandem and there's a direct correlation.
How did you determine the priorities in questions of protecting the environment? I don't think it's so much our national priority. How do you determine international priorities? Today's discussion, we've not talked about the international aspect of the problem.
Of course, today, all problems.
First of all, I have to say that we must, after we've considered matters in greater detail, we must come up with some constructive proposals so that something will be born of our discussion today and will lead to real steps forward. What about priorities now? We're going to have different priorities for our big country. And this is slightly alarming. The economy is going to have to move to different systems of management. 16% of our country is an ecological disaster zone. The southern Urals, in Ukraine and so on, are going to have different priorities. We'll have to have a sharp drop in the incidence of disease, for example. In the Far East and the Far North are going to have a very different approach to the use of natural resources. Their priorities are going to be the preservation of traditional cultures and the indigenous tribes. We're going to have to take a different approach. But I think it would be better for us to go into further depth in certain issues. One of them was mentioned by Mr. Bockus. What kind of society should we strive for? How do we see ourselves in the future? Perhaps we might have questions from the auditorium on this.
Yes, yes.